from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
It is a special privilege to welcome you back to our series that we are doing over a several-week period entitled Journey Through Time, Visits to 5 Historical Cities. Today on the program we return to Athens. We were there last week also, and we're going to be looking at a period from approximately 450 to 350 BC. Two of our 3 guests lived in that period, the other one in a different time, and we're very delighted to welcome to the program 3 historical characters, and the people playing those are from North Idaho, but we're going to be doing it in the context of who they are portraying. First of all, I welcome to the program George Ives, who's a member of the faculty at North Idaho College, and he's here today to portray Socrates, who was, as you well know, a great Greek philosopher who lived from about 470 to 399 BC. Mr. Socrates, welcome to the program, and we look forward to having you to come to our time to talk about your philosophy.
It is truly a pleasure to be here, Mr. Stewart.
I'm equally very pleased to welcome to the program Amelia Phillips, who's also a member of the faculty at North Idaho College, and she is here today to be in character or to portray Paternion, who was the writer of Wisdom and Harmony of Women. She did some other works, and her works are now beginning to be recognized in modern times, and she also was the mother of Plato, and she was estimated to live somewhere between 450 and 350 BC. Welcome to our program. We're delighted to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And our third guest is Rodney Fry, who's the director in North Idaho of Lewis and Clark State College, and he is here today to portray Theseus, who was a mystic hero to a historical king, and we celebrate his works from the 9th century BC. Often you're described as where you're from the gods, or what your background was, and you're also known as the father of democracy, and welcome to our program.
It's an honor to be here.
And as always, I'm so pleased to have our 2 panel members. First of all is Janel Berg, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Sheen, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And we shall ask Janel Berg to commence today's questioning of our historical figures.
I have a 2-part question for each one of you, and we'll start with Theseus. But the 2-part question is, first of all, how do you think of yourself? And secondly, how do you want to be remembered in history? What is the thing that you gave to history? How would you like to be remembered? So how do you see yourself?
Thank you. That's a great question. I am a semi-god. I'm an immediate intermediary between the gods and mortals. In my veins flow the blood of a god, Poseidon. In my deeds, I entered the labyrinth and slew the Minotaur. I led the army against the Amazons and saved the city of Athens. And I'm credited with having established the custom of using potsherds in elections, that is, a secret ballot helping start elections, and ridding Athens of the aristocracy, of establishing democracy there. I think of myself as an eternal hero, existing throughout all of time and not placed in any given time, but accessible and meaningful for all generations to aspire toward.
And that's the way you want to be remembered,
exactly
as the father of democracy.
A contributor, and as a hero, I'm proud of it.
Okay. And Pertion, is that how you would say your name?
Yes, that is correct.
And how do you think of yourself?
I think of myself as a woman philosopher, and I think of myself most of all as a realist, because women in my time period were very restricted by society. They had to obey the rules of men. They had to put up with whatever men did, and yet maintain the harmony in the home. And so only a woman philosopher could come up with the proper way of approaching life for a woman. And I wish to be remembered as one of the first women philosophers, and as a Pythagorean.
As the mother of Plato, do you think of yourself as the mother of Plato?
Yes, I'm quite proud of my son, but I'm also quite proud of my daughter, Petone, who wrote the work on the Pythagorean numbers.
And Socrates, how do you think of yourself?
Well, I think of myself differently than perhaps most people who recall my condemnation and death of drinking hemlock at the citizens of Athens. I recall myself would want to be known as a teacher. I am a teacher. My student, Plato's student, was Aristotle. And Aristotle and Plato's name are linked with mine throughout history as originators of many of the greatest ideas that have come down to form what is today your democracy. And I think that that would be the lasting contribution of any teacher, to be known by the students that he has taught and mentored through, and to be associated with them, and to be remembered in their writings, as I was in the writings of your son Plato. That would be my legacy.
Steve Sheen.
Theseus, if I could start with you, and I bet that hero business is good work if you can get it. Could you tell us just a little bit more about some of your maybe less well-known adventures?
Well, there are so many. I certainly I slew all the bandits that were in waiting along the way to Athens, paving the way for a free movement of people, helping unite all of Attica. The tribes were in rebellion against each other, making Athens the center of a great nation state.
If I can interrupt you for just a second, tell our viewers what Attica is.
That was the peninsula area that surrounds the Athens area.
Thank you.
Everyone should know that, of course, as my name should be a household word.
I couldn't agree more.
But in those adventures, and I helped pave the way for a safe world, a world that people could focus in on their livelihood and develop the greater arts of democracy and diplomacy and nobility.
And Perctation, you mentioned that you're proud of being a Pythagorean, and it's a little like my question about Attica, but I'm thinking mostly of the children who might not be as well informed as we are. Of course, could you tell us what that means to you?
Okay, being a Pythagorean means that, first of all, I have turned over all my wealth to the group, and I'm living in a group. I have become a vegetarian. Pythagoreans did not participate in, for example, the sacrifice of animals. They still worshiped the gods, of course. We still paid homage. However, we did not slaughter the animals. We meditated, we exercised daily, and we studied because we had a love of learning. And many of your great athletes of that time were also Pythagoreans.
Thank you. And Socrates, could you tell us a little bit about what it would be like to be a student in your school?
In my school was all of Athens, and in the marketplace, my school would follow me, and we would go about the marketplace and talk with people coming and going about their business, to engage them in dialogue and to ask them the important questions of who are you, and how did you come to this place? How should we treat one another? Essentially, the whys of what makes man man. That was the school in a nutshell, of course.
Now, all of Athens, in your terms, might be a little different than ours. For instance, would women have been in your school, or was it limited to men only?
My colleague on the panel obviously is an educated woman. So there certainly were women who were educated, but within the school setting, it was for young male citizens of Athens, a very restricted number by your modern day definition, but the true meaning.
Thank you.
Perctation, I want to start with you on my next question, or my first question actually on the program today. The TV series that we're doing, that our viewers are watching over most of the summer, emerged out of a symposium at North Idaho College, and over that 5-day period we had a moral dilemma each day that we were debating, and on the day that we visited Athens we were talking about democracy versus aristocracy, or some kind of autocratic system in trying to settle the issues of the times. Your son certainly was known as someone who was an advocate of the aristocracy, and yet as a woman you were looking at issues I would think somewhat different from even your son. Would you give us your viewpoints on, I know we have to do it in the context of your time, and we've brought you through time to a period in which democracy is really come into its own. But would you give us your thoughts on this dilemma that we are discussing?
Well, I'd be more than happy to. Keep in mind that I witnessed my very uncle, Critias, becoming one of the 30 tyrants who slew at least 1,500 Democrats in their rise to power. And from my perspective as a woman of that period of time, I saw that power and position corrupted people. It leads to treachery and envy and malice. And I think that people who are in those positions have to be very, very careful about those trappings. And therefore, I do not believe in aristocracy.
You were very concerned with the growth of power and the concentration of power.
Yes.
You also personally suffered some from that, did you not, or when this was happening?
When this was happening, I fled with my son Plato. We really did not like what we were seeing.
It's somewhat unfair to ask you this question without Mr. Plato here, but when he talked about the aristocracy with some benevolence and the philosopher king and so forth, did your son have some experiences that caused any concern for him, although he certainly was not, as one of our other guests, one of the founders of democracy. But was he influenced by those experiences that you and other members of the family had?
Oh, certainly. He was influenced by the salons that I held in my home. He was exposed to Socrates' teachings during those periods of time. And then the major upheavals that occurred definitely impacted him. Unfortunately, when Socrates was put to death, that really had an impact on him and changed his mind about a lot of things.
In what direction did that move him?
That moved him towards the aristocracy, much more so.
Mr. Socrates, would you please give us your views? And I'll go, again, I'd repeat the saying in the context of the time which you lived, not being able to see the future.
In the time that I lived, government did not serve the average person well. When the 30 tyrants took command, they asked that we do go out and capture people who were opposed to their regime, and I refused to do so, which they did not find amusing in the least. As you well know, it was the Democrats who condemned me to death at their hands. So from my perspective, neither an aristocracy nor a democracy have served the interests of people, individuals, very well. What's critical is the individual mind, the individual person seeking the truth and seeking virtue, the goal being goodness, and only by questing can that take place, not by systems of governance.
The two systems that were vying in your time, and again, I would suggest that when you talk about the democracy or the Democrats, it would be primitive compared with the development of democracy today. But both of those systems were, and those times were defensive, and so was part of the problem is that you were too questioning, you were too threatening to both systems. If I can add to this, we hear so much about the Socratic method of teaching, inquiring mind, I would suppose we would call it today.
The Socratic method, as it has been used around this table, was simply an honest attempt to find the truth. Philosopher, which I chose as my life goal, philosophy simply means the love of wisdom, the love of learning. And as one seeks the truth, in whatever form that may be, one must suffer the consequences of that quest. When my compatriots trying me before the tribunal asked what penalty should be imposed upon me, I suggested that in all honesty they should elect to erect a statue of me in the public marketplace. They were not amused.
And that was not their decision.
That was not their decision, no.
Thank you. Mr. Thesis, you've heard the other two guests that we have with us. Obviously, they were not as appreciative of what you would be advocating. Would you, I assume, come down on the side of democracy as one that would have vision? You would be able to see more into the future, would you not, of what it would encompass someday?
I am most appreciative and intrigued by mortal dealings. Their experiments with democracy or aristocracy are fun to watch from afar. What concerns me, though, is when they meddle too far, when they stray too far in free thinking, when they quest too far away from the gods and from the teachings of the heroes. We have brought forth everything, the customs, the law, everything that is true. And when they turn their back on that, when they turn their back on us and try to make their own way through the labyrinth of life, we fear for their safety and for their future, whatever form of government they take. And today, in what I've heard others talk about in this age that we are visiting with now, the issues of famine and genocide, the issues of the environment, concern me with the fact that neither system has been able to address some of those important issues and their relationship with the world around them.
One final question before I go back to the panel, Mr. Thesis. Since you're, I believe, saying, or I hear you saying, that humans are too much on their own or too much experimenting, how would you advocate that they be in touch with you or with the gods?
We like active minds. We're not opposed to free thinkers, but it needs to be balanced with meditation and prayer and respect and honoring of the heroes and gods. There needs to be a balance.
And through that process you could have that communication.
Exactly.
Janel Berg.
Well, beginning with you, Theseus, it's been said that you have more than one face. Would you like to show us your faces?
Well, in the evolution of who I have been around since the beginning of time, since time immemorial, as an active, as a strong, as a warrior, slaying the monsters. And this face represented me in this age. But when I was thrown from the cliffs of Skyros by a jealous king, dying, and my bones reinterred in Athens, I became immortal and a tragic figure. And it was this transformation of my character that so paralleled the characterization, the transformation of Greek life from one which was based in the gods to one which was based in man.
Now, my next question is for both Socrates and also for Perction. It's a question about comparative government in the other city-states. Today, in the 20th century, we have various forms of government in other countries, as well as our own form of government. That was true in your day as well. The other city-states had other kinds of government. Can you make some comparisons between your government and some of the other governments, and what did you think of them?
The Athenians, of course, were superior, were they not?
Of course.
We would agree on that, I believe.
And what was happening in, say, for example, Sparta? How was Sparta different from you, and what was happening there? Would you like to go first?
Spartans are such warlike people that reasoning with the Spartan was only possible after you had stomped upon his head and slit his throat. There seemed little point at that time to engage them in dialogue.
So you saw them as not a free-thinking people, nearly
perhaps
as free
almost
as
animal,
you
perhaps
were.
Not quite human in the sense that we speak of the Athenian Greek as being fully human.
Well, my perspective, again, is from Harmonia and from the perspective of women. One of my contemporaries, Phintus of Sparta, wrote along the same lines as I did. She was also very much a realist and spoke again of women taking care of the home and taking care of the family and obeying the husband. And so in that respect, there was not very much different so far as the status of women in both societies. Now, so far as the governments were concerned, I believe Mr. Socrates has pointed those out.
Theseus, do you have anything to add about all the various kinds of governments that were going on in Greece? And did people know about them other than just as they happened to encounter each other in wartime?
Well, of course, we as heroes got around a lot. So we had the advantage of being everywhere at all times to compare and contrast. And I must admit, the Athenians did a fine job of establishing government. It's unfortunate that their legacy often got corrupted through time. And I would hope that we would pay attention to the deeds and the accomplishments so that we can learn from those lessons today. They certainly had a lot for us to learn from.
Steve G.
Perction, can you tell us a little bit more about the advice and I assume it's a how-to book, the advice that you gave to women in the book on the harmony of women?
Certainly. First of all, a woman has responsibilities. The same way the man is responsible for taking care of the business outside of the home, the woman is responsible for that inside the home. And she has to be concerned about her children, her servants, any visitors who come in, any foreigners. And in order to keep that harmony, she must obey her husband. And in doing so, she must first of all think about not being extravagant. If you are born aristocratic, that's okay, but do not go around buying the gold and the purples and the royal blues and things like that, but to be very, very modest. Because the women who were very, very extravagant in their dress were also the ones who would be deceitful and then would create disharmony in the home. So it was very, very important for women to concentrate more on wisdom rather than on the physical attributes. And that is basically what On the Harmony of Women is about. And then when you go into my writing on wisdom, you will find more concentration on looking at all the different disciplines and putting those together, because the person who is wise will actually create more harmony.
Thank you. Socrates, are you surprised at the celebrity status that you've achieved in our time?
From what I've seen of your program and the limited time I've been allowed by the gods to take this new and reconstituted form, I've been immensely impressed. I saw myself as the weakest mind. I knew that I knew nothing, and yet throughout the ages, this one simple trait has been carried forth and become now a defining moment of how educated men see themselves.
Thank you. Theseus, you were a king who was often criticized for your adventurous spirit, for the fact that you were often away doing hero things, I suppose. How do you respond to that?
It was always for the greater good, and simply not for myself, I'm sure. No. But again, in my actions and deeds, I laid the foundation for understanding bravery and valor. There would be a war, there would be an aggression, there would be a conflict, but always tempered with the understanding of doing it for justice and for right and for the common good of all of humanity, and not for myself, to be sure. There's a wisdom there. There's a wisdom there that we need to pay attention to. And it's often lost because so much of who I have been was told aloud, only told aloud, and so little of it written down, that what was written down, meager as it was, distorted the totality of who I am and can become for those who would listen to the stories. Again, there's a magic to the stories of my deeds when they're told properly.
Thank you.
I have a question that relates to both Theseus and Socrates. As we're sitting here and looking at your ideas, and we've looked at others that we have invited to travel through time to visit with us, in both of your cases, they're not volumes of work we can look at and analyze like we can with some others, such as even Plato. Then how would you explain, starting with Socrates, the influence that you have from just inviting people to think? I find it's amazing that, and you seem to be impressed with, that you're a household name, and would you respond to why that has impacted the way it has without leaving volumes of work behind in great detail with a very structured philosophy?
I'm puzzled by that. It would seem to me, and yet essentially the soul defines the person's self. And so the things that men pursue, and women too in this age, are things so often of unreal nature. Power, unlimited wealth, in the sense that these would bring happiness. And yet we know throughout the ages that these have not brought happiness to those who sought them or to those who achieved them. In fact, quite often the attainment of more power has been the seed of someone's downfall rather than their satisfaction. And so we need to realize how important is this concept that by knowing the true good and not confusing the mere shadows of goodness through things of this transitory world, that we find peace and contentment. And I think that may well be one cause, at least.
So you're finding that's the path to happiness and contentment, as you say?
Moderation seems important.
In our time where you're visiting, a number of people who've been very wealthy and very famous have had, in the end, very unhappy lives, and in some cases even suicides. And we know in your case it was for a different reason than what I'm speaking of.
My wife and many of my contemporaries criticized me for not making a better living for my family and for her. She would, of course, like gold. I do my best to keep her a virtuous woman by keeping her from that temptation. But as I consider how really important moderation has become, I say, my, what a lot of things I don't need.
Mr. Thesis, in the short time we have we need to have you respond to that. How you've been so remembered without volumes of work to look at?
The deeds of heroes are always to be remembered around a good campfire, to be sure. I guess I do lament a little bit, though. It's a double-edged sword. Sword's a very appropriate metaphor for what I have done in my life, in that the writing of deeds, in a way isolates us from that deed that we recount in the storytelling. And I lament that so little of me has been brought forth into this contemporary age. To be sure, what little has come through the writing. But certainly in the telling of the stories, do not we revisit that place in time?
Thank you. And we have just such a little amount of time left. I want Pertion to be able to say about her writings and all. How do you feel about what has happened and the influence that your work has?
I'm very grateful that women historians are now finding my work and validating the fact that I did actually exist and applying that to their own time. And it will be a challenge because now society has changed. And if the women are still realists, they will understand how to change how I wrote on the harmony of women.
I speak for Janel and Steve and our staff to thank all three of you for traveling a long time through time to be with us, and we've enjoyed it immensely. And ladies and gentlemen, I would invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, when I'm happy to report that we will continue our journey through time, visits to 5 historical cities. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.